everyone. Welcome back to PCS 101. This is our class for Friday, the 6th of January, where we are talking about the next three chapters in our textbook: delivering speeches, culture, and audience. And as you know, you are preparing for your first speech, your autobiographical speech, which is 5 minutes long, where you are either giving an overview of your life, or perhaps you're focusing on a time period or an element or even a person about your life. One of the things that I will be asking you to do today is to watch some sample autobiographical speeches from students like yourself, no way affiliated with GCC, so you don't need to worry that one day that you will be reviewed by a class. But I wanted to give you some samples of speeches that you could review and talk a little bit about their strengths and weaknesses. So, in terms of where we were last class, you're talking a little bit about the importance of planning and outlining and organizing, and the importance of the introduction, which is where you greet your audience. And oftentimes, this is where public speakers, because of anxiety, will just go straight into their speech without remembering to greet everyone. So, you definitely want to remember that. And the concluding part of the speech, which oftentimes, again, speakers will rush through because they are eager to finish speaking. You want to make sure that you say farewell to your audience. And that said, we discussed the primary recency effect, that individuals tend to remember best what they hear first and last. So the idea of a first or a last impression is particularly important, just because of that phenomenon. In terms of delivering speeches, there are lots of different ways that you can deliver speeches. And what we've been focusing on is the extemporaneous speech, which is something that is prepared in advance and delivered with a speaking outline. You're not reading it verbatim, it's not memorized. You're trying to keep a sense of conversationality with your audience. Now, there is such a thing as a manuscript speech where you could read your speech word for word. Usually, this is for highly formal events for which there is little or no room for error. Think of something like a presidential address or something like a presentation, let's say on television that was timed, let's say a news report where it had to be down to the second. And oftentimes, manuscript speeches are accompanied by teleprompters, though not necessarily always. In academia, for instance, it's very common to read paper. And literally, what you would do at a conference is read your paper to a group of scholars so that you could get some feedback about your scholarship. The manuscript speech can morph into something like the teleprompter speech, where you are reading the speech, but because you've got the technology of a teleprompter, it appears that you aren't reading. Oftentimes, again, entertainers will do something like this. Now, I've never had the opportunity to give a teleprompter speech, but even if you do have the opportunity to give a teleprompter speech, that's not to say that something can't go wrong. And in fact, if you look at the notes below in the first section where it says Delivering Speeches, Chapter 10, in bold, I have Watch Teleprompter Fail video. It's a short video of about 2 minutes or so with a very noted Hollywood producer who basically experiences some technological failure with his teleprompter and basically is unable to continue with his presentation, even though he knows the material very well. He's talking about his own movies, but in the heat of the moment, he was so anxious that he had to rush off stage. So, this is Michael Bay. You might have heard of him from some of his action films. So I think this is a good illustration of how even a teleprompter is not a fail-safe way for delivering a speech. Now, the impromptu speech is spur of the moment with no kind of preparation ahead of time. I usually encourage people to avoid these kinds of speeches if at all possible. Usually they occur at things like award ceremonies where you aren't expecting to give a speech, but perhaps you're presented with an award and you have to give a speech. Keep it short and simple is my advice to you, because less is more. You don't want to continue talking and basically go down a path where you lose control of the speech itself. So again, we aren't focusing on the impromptu or spur of the moment speech, even with the first speech, which is about yourself, so that you know this material very well, but still you want to make sure that you've got a speaking outline. And in fact, you need to send your speaking outline to me via email on the day in which you post your speech so that I can evaluate that outline with your speech. And you don't have access to a teleprompter. And even if you had something that was low tech like a teleprompter, you could see that ultimately that's no fail safe way for delivering a speech. And we aren't delivering a manuscript speech where basically you are reading to your audience, nor are you memorizing, which works very well for brief speeches where, again, there's little or no room for error, highly formal events, maybe something like a toast at a wedding, but certainly not the kind of speeches that we would be delivering. And when we're delivering speeches, we want to think about voice and vocal inflections. Again, you want to be conversational. You want to vary things like your volume and your speed and your inflections so that you can keep audience interest. You want to enunciate, which means that you aren't mumbling, which is different than pronunciation. And that said, if you are not a native speaker, your pronunciation might be something that you are anxious about. If so, you can even address it at the beginning of the speech and state something to the effect of that English is not your native language, but if you have problems with understanding, or if it happened to be that day that you happen to have laryngitis, and again, you could begin your speech by saying that you're having some vocal problems, but certainly, if anybody had any questions, they could ask them in the comments section of your speech. So this puts additional burden on the audience rather than on you when you are delivering. Pausing for both effect and also as an opportunity to get in breaths. So many of you indicated in your discussion forum questions the importance of breathing in deeply. You also talked about, several of you, the importance of sleep, which is quite true. Excuse me. In fact, what studies have found is that REM sleep increases when you are learning new material, and then it decreases back to regular levels. What that means is that basically your mind is doing something when you are trying to absorb new material, which is why your dream sleep increases. Allow that process to happen. So you want to sleep at least long enough so that you can dream. Proxemics, the way that you use space, and this is a discipline in and of itself. And again, I know you're going to be recorded so that this might perhaps be less of an issue. Certainly things like furniture arrangement and how close or far away you are from your audience. But you can think about this in terms of your camera angles as well. And I don't know if you've ever seen what I call the dance, where two people have different definitions of personal space, which is the area of space that feels comfortable around you. And this was before social distancing, so that might have changed a bit in the last couple of years. And sometimes that's an individual preference, sometimes it's culturally based. And we'll be talking about culture in a few minutes. But if you see two people who are speaking who have different comfort levels with physical space, what you oftentimes see is one person step forward so they can be closer to the other person because they feel comfortable with less physical space. And if the other person feels uncomfortable because they want more physical space, they'll usually take a step back. And this can continue on until people actually move around the room that way. And both of them are uncomfortable and they don't necessarily even know why. But the idea is that there's been a violation of physical space for both of them, and they may not even consciously be aware of it. Affect display, facial expressions, which is usually how we read most people. Especially if you're being recorded, you want to focus on the face. Gesturing, which is something that may or may not necessarily be on the video. That said, there are lots of different ways that you can gesture. Oftentimes we have conventional gestures where a meaning is assigned by custom. So for instance, something like a thumbs up could mean that it's good or okay. Keep in mind that this is also culturally based. So, for instance, the OK sign, where you've got your thumb and your index finger basically making a circle with your three fingers standing up, sort of like this, in some cultures is an offensive gesture. So you need to be careful in making sure that you're using gestures that are culturally understood with your audience. There are descriptive gestures that basically describe things like shape and size, something being this big perhaps and this high, and that's much more universal. And there are also indicators, gestures that can express feelings. So, slamming a fist on a table, for instance, to emphasize a particular emotion. Eye contact. And if you're working with a live audience, you want to vary your eye contact across the audience. Or if that feels uncomfortable to you, look at the top of audience heads or at the three sections of a room, the two corners in the middle, and that will oftentimes give the appearance of eye contact. With something like a camera, you want to make sure that you are staring straight into the camera so that ultimately when we are viewing it, it appears as if you are speaking with us. And in terms of culture, which I had indicated that I wanted to talk about, I guess in the broadest definition of the term, it's any group membership. That said, usually we talk about culture in terms of very specific demographic elements. Demographics are those observable traits that you can identify. Things like age, or things like gender, or things like ethnicity. Not that you can always identify those things, but oftentimes you can. So those are usually the large cultural groups that we talk about, but there are some that are much less visible. Things like geographic region, education, political affiliation, religion. And then there are some cultural groups that are much smaller than these large groups that I've been addressing. Any group membership, I guess we could debate whether or not two people or not would qualify as a group. Certainly they qualify as a pair, but three or more would definitely qualify as a group. And that means that our class, for better or for worse, is a culture that we have formed a sense of community. And this is true of lots of different cultures. If you think about the culture of dog lovers that I was referencing earlier in a previous class, or pug lovers, I can definitely tell you we're a culture. Sports aficionados can form their own culture. Hobbies oftentimes result in cultures forming. So they can be big, they can be small. And the thing with the culture is that it will influence on some level behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, and finally values. Not always. You don't want to stereotype, assume that everyone within a group is exactly the same, because there always is individual difference. But that said, there's always a predictive element when it comes to culture. So for something like behaviors, and this can include conversational style, whether you tend to be very short and direct or whether you tend to be much more long-winded. And sometimes that's influenced by personal preference, but sometimes it's influenced by culture. So in Western cultures, for instance, it's highly valued to be concise and direct, where there are other cultures, like Asian cultures, for instance, where that would be seen as rude. And the idea is that there should be a kind of storytelling approach. The same with thinking about attitudes or feelings, in that oftentimes those are things that can change based on situation, but oftentimes can be culturally determined, which gets to our beliefs, the things that we view as true or false, which again can be individually determined, but it can also be culturally based as well. And that leads to finally values. And values, I would say, are a combination of all these things: behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs, that ultimately they form values, and those are highly resistant to change. Things like behaviors or beliefs or attitudes are more likely to be changed. This will be something that will be important when we talk about the persuasive speech. And I had indicated that even though we are still in the early part of the semester, it's not a bad idea to begin thinking about possibilities for your informative speech and possibilities for your persuasive speech as well. And that at this point in the semester, it would be a good idea for you to think about reaching out to me to talk about, at the very least, the first speech. Some of you have already done so. But if not, then certainly contact me so that we can set up some sort of a connection. It could be as simple as just having a very brief email dialogue about your topic. But if you wanted to have something a little bit more in depth, we could arrange a Zoom meeting or a phone call meeting so that we could talk about your speech more in depth. And you could even record your speech or present it on Zoom, and I could give you some feedback before you actually have to present it for your grade or upload it for a grade, which is on Tuesday. But that said, there isn't any reason why you couldn't start playing around with ideas for the informative speech where you are teaching the audience something, or for the persuasive speech where you're trying to convince the audience of something. And culture is quite tricky. You know, they're things that you don't necessarily think are culturally based. You think of them as more objective, and they're really not. And I think about a former colleague of mine from Africa, and he used to talk about time and how time is viewed so differently in Africa as opposed to the United States in his experience. And he used bus schedules as an example, that in the United States a bus leaves at 3:14 because it has a schedule that it needs to maintain. It needs to be someplace else at 3:17, and so forth and so on. So it doesn't matter if the bus is empty or the bus is full, it needs to be at its location at a particular time. In Africa, it's the exact opposite, in that a bus wouldn't leave if it were empty just to make a location at a particular time. A bus would leave when it's full, regardless of the time, and it would arrive at its location in many respects at an unknown time because it would be unknown when the bus would leave, and that this would be the most efficient use of resources. And it's not that one perspective is better than another perspective. It's just a different way of viewing culture, and just a different lens in which to think about the world. So in Africa, it's not so much that time is something that can be wasted in the way that we think of it in the United States as a commodity. Time is much more fluid in Africa, and that time serves the person rather than the person serving time, which is more of the United States sentiment. I always think about that story. And that said, thinking about all of these elements when you're presenting can be very important because you're trying to think about your audience. And chances are you're going to have a multicultural audience, which means many, many different cultures. And honestly, all of us belong to many, many different kinds of cultures. Some very large ones, again, based on things like gender, ethnicity, and age. And then some very, very specific ones, such as being a community college student, for instance, or living in Western Massachusetts, for instance, or being a needlepoint aficionado, for instance, or whatever the case may happen to be. So, as I was indicating, demographics, and this gets us into audience, the last section of today's presentation. These are the observable characteristics of individuals, things like age and gender and ethnic background and so forth. And advertisers in particular spend a good amount of time measuring things like demographics to try to predict which groups are likely watching at a particular time or listening at a particular time so they can direct their advertisements to that group. It's an inexact science, but it oftentimes has a certain level of validity to it. It would make sense that if you're trying to sell toys, you probably want to have a younger demographic, though the reality is that children are not the ones who buy the toys, the adults are the ones who buy the toys. So you have to take that into consideration as well. And in terms of audience, the textbook also talks about something that I doubt any of you will ever encounter, a hostile audience. Usually that's something that occurs that is very obvious. For instance, in a political situation when you know you are presenting to the opposition. But it is quite possible that you could be presenting to a skeptical audience, especially once we start giving speeches in the persuasive realm, where your particular job isn't necessarily to persuade everybody in the audience to agree with you. That's an impossibility. Your job is to earn everyone's respect. So there might be somebody whose beliefs and values and attitudes are so firmly embedded that it doesn't necessarily matter what you say or do in a speech. That's not going to change their perspective. But they can acknowledge that you gave a good speech. So, but if you ever do have a hostile or skeptical audience, I don't have a magic bullet for you, but some suggestions. Try to establish goodwill. Think about establishing areas of agreement so that at least there's some commonality with you and your audience. Use credible outside sources, and it's one of the reasons why we'll be using outside sources in the persuasive speech, because that helps to improve your credibility. Be professional always. So you want to be well prepared. You want to know your stuff. So again, someone can at least admire your presentation, even if they don't necessarily agree with your message. Use humor. But that said, humor can oftentimes be culturally based as well and individually based. You need to be careful with humor. What's funny to one person could be offensive to another. And try to be multi-sided. A lot of times people just want to be heard and acknowledged. Not, or in other words, try not to avoid what I call the elephant in the room, the obvious counter argument. Better to just address it. And sometimes that's enough for people to feel that they're heard. And oftentimes that can diffuse some hostility or some skepticism. So as I had indicated, I have 3 sample autobiographical speeches for you to watch, and they were posted on YouTube, so I'm assuming that they are available for public consumption. Again, in no way affiliated with GCC. The first speech, I think, fits in very nicely with what I've been talking about in terms of culture, because you will see that the first speaker is from the military and speaking to a military audience. So that is going to mean some changes in the way the speech is presented, and even just the attire of the speaker and the audience members. And then the second speech and the third speech, both very different from one another. Actually, all 3 speeches, all very different from one another. And while we can't necessarily evaluate the speeches based on time, because I don't know necessarily what time limits they were given in terms of delivering their speeches, we can definitely evaluate the speeches based on things like introduction, body, and conclusion, which is what we've been talking about, and presentation. And you'll see that ultimately these speeches were done probably for public speaking classes where they were perhaps asked to film their audience, or in other instances asked not to film their audience. Depends on the class and the situation. Obviously, it's a different kind of experience when you are presenting in front of an audience and being filmed than presenting in front of no one and being filmed. And you'll remember that I had talked about on the syllabus, we've got a speech rating handout, a template that I'm going to be using to evaluate your first speech. And basically, it divides up the speech into content, which is introduction, body, and conclusion. And it goes through and it talks about things like getting your audience's attention. And then there's a spectrum here from excellent to good to needs improvement to none. And it could be just as simple as greeting your audience and saying hello. And then the transition, which again moves from excellent, good, needs improvement to none, to a preview statement where you're starting to talk about your thesis or your main point. Again, excellent, good, needs improvement, or none. And then we go to the body, and that's where you give your evidence and details. And do you have a clear pattern? Again, excellent, good, needs improvement, or none. Are your main points stated? Excellent, good, needs improvement, or none. Do you develop these points? Again, excellent, good, needs improvement, or none. Voice mannerisms. And these can be things like ums or ahs. And well-chosen words. Excellent, good, needs improvement, and poor. And then there's a conclusion where hopefully there's some kind of summary restatement. And then finally a concluding statement where you're saying farewell to your audience. So that's the content piece, but you also want to think about the delivery speech. Eye contact. Are you looking at your camera? Body movement, depending on how much of your body is visible. Vocal quality, again, that you're trying not to mumble, and that's different again from pronunciation. Chances are you're not going to be able to change your pronunciation in a short period of time, nor should you try. You just want to make sure that you can speak clearly, and that's different than pronunciation. And think about how oftentimes pronunciation is influenced by region, so that we will say words one way in one locale and say them in other ways in other locales. And think about also some words that we don't seem to have agreement with in terms of pronunciation, where we stress the syllable. So is it harassment or harassment? Is it Caribbean or Caribbean? So if you know foreign languages, then you know that many of the Romance languages will literally use accent marks in the spelling of their words to help direct individuals as to how to stress a particular form of a word. We don't do that in English, which is why I struggle with words like Bernardston or Bernardston, because I'm not local and I'm never quite sure about where to put the accent. So in addition to vocal quality, articulation. Again, how clearly are you forming your words, and is your volume loud enough for your audience to hear? And enthusiasm. And some of this is acting. That even if you don't feel enthusiastic, act enthusiastic. Because if you're not enthusiastic, why should we be enthusiastic? And that's also ranked on a scale of poor, needs improvement, good, or excellent. And outside of the first speech, I don't even necessarily bother using this template. But it is, I just take notes of strengths and weaknesses. But I think this template is useful for you in the construction of your own speech, and is also useful when you are evaluating the speeches of others. And you'll be doing both in the context of this class. And you'll see that at the ending of that template, I just wrote out the elements associated with content. What is the quality of the introduction? Does it start with an effective and appropriate attention getter? And does it lead smoothly from the intro to the body? What is the structure of the body? Are your main points and subpoints clearly related? Do you follow a logical pattern? Supporting material. Do you use examples, visual aids, stories? Language. Do you use words that appeal to the ear, such as active verbs, first and second person pronouns, expressions full of images? Do you avoid the use of slang except for special effect? Are your transitions clear and varied? Do you avoid verbal mannerisms such as and? In conclusion, do you give your audience a feeling of completeness after the speech? And then delivery, eye contact. Do you look directly at the audience? Do you ensure that your manuscript, your note cards, whatever it is you happen to be using, your visual aids, do not interfere with your eye contact? Your body movements, are your gestures intended to enhance communication? How well do you handle your visual aids? That's something that we won't be addressing until the next speech. Does your posture provide a positive image? Voice and articulation. Is your voice firm and audible? Do you enunciate properly? Is your pronunciation correct? And enthusiasm and directness. Do you give your audience the feeling that you're talking to them or concerned about their need to be informed or persuaded? Is your energy level consistently high during the speech? Believe it or not, we've actually covered most of the major elements of the textbook. As I had indicated, I wanted to do that up front, early rather than later, so that you could utilize these suggestions and techniques when you are putting together your own speeches, which is something that we will be doing next week. On Monday, what I will be doing is having our first quiz. That'll be 20 questions, mostly short answer, some multiple choice and true false also are possibilities, based on textbook material and class videos. So I'm hoping that it's more than just an exercise to encourage you to read the book, but that the questions are questions that will help you in terms of formulating your first and all of your other speeches. And what I've got scheduled for the rest of that class, in addition to that quiz is the practice session. So anytime between now and basically before Tuesday, do contact me about what you're thinking about with your speech, and then we can take it from there. We can have as much or as little contact as you'd like. And in terms of thinking about today's attendance question, that's directly related to the 3 sample autobiographical speeches that I am going to be asking you to watch. In addition to watching all 3 of these speeches, I'm going to ask you to identify a strength and a weakness of each of these speeches. And that'll serve as your attendance. And of course, that will be due in 24 hours. So if you are watching this video on Friday, that would be Saturday at 9 a.m. Though if you need additional time, please let me know and I'll be happy to accommodate. So again, on Monday, we will have our quiz, which I will be posting, as well as the practice session, if you haven't already made arrangements with me for a practice session, so that on Tuesday you can upload your speech. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next week. Take care. Bye-bye.